Anyway, so I've been wanting to get you actually on since I started pursuing the team behind The Other Side of the Wind a couple years back, more than a couple actually, probably closer to 5 years ago, when I first started seeing press coming together that Netflix had purchased or was doing, producing it, the final edit, and I saw your name always associated with that. So I forget who I was talking to or emailing with early on, but I know that. So eventually, I just got Josh Karp on a bunch of times, who's even before that, and then I got on Peter Bogdanovich, Frank
Marshall.
No, not Frank Marshall. I tried, not for lack of But this is a great day because I've got Filip on here, and that's what I was trying to get at mostly. Orson Welles is not returning my phone calls, but I don't
He's
know.
Not available these days.
Okay, I thought it was in his. He stipulated even after he died, he would still be available to promote his films, but apparently I'm wrong. Tell me a little bit about how you got involved with Orson Welles. We're primarily here to talk about the latest project, which is called Hopper Welles, which I guess Welles shot with Dennis Hopper around the time of The Other Side of the Wind, and right as Hopper was getting ready to shoot, or maybe was already in production for the last movie.
I mean, Hopper was at that point kind of deep into the edit on last movie.
Okay, so
Welles was at the very beginning of shooting Other Side of the Wind. He started in August of '70. This interview or conversation, or however you want to classify it, was November of '70. So very early on, and at this point, Welles had shot some of the film within the film. And then he had shot some stuff with Bogdanovich at that point, playing the cineast, not the young hotshot filmmaker, and then some stuff with Joe McBride, really as the character that Joe continued to be, just slowly. At that point, he was a younger Joe McBride, would then eventually become a slightly older Joe McBride 7 years later, once they finally finished. So that's where each of them was. In terms of how I came into this Welles universe, it was about 11 years ago, and really is just kind of a series of coincidences. I was in Cannes, and somebody told me that the rights were available, which obviously, it's I didn't know about the project. I had read about it in a story that appeared in Vanity Fair, which then was a collection of stories, or really of pieces on films with very strange backgrounds, troubled productions. And the piece was on Ambersons, and at the very end, there was a mention of Other Side of the Wind. So I had some prior knowledge when I took this meeting in Cannes, and it resulted in an introduction to Oya Kodar and being sent the script. And that started me on the journey. And the more I looked into it, the more I became fascinated by it. And then once you start investing, at this point, when you start investing years in it, you just kind of want to see it through. And then, my approach was a little bit different than anybody else. I mean, obviously I met everybody who had been involved and tried and failed. But my approach was to really tackle it from the French side, knowing that that's where Orson tried and failed, and that's where the negative was stored, and trying to figure out what that court order was and what would be the best way to lift it.
How much certainty did you have, referring just to The Other Side of the Wind, just for my or confidence is the better word. How much confidence did you have that you would be able to untangle the legal morass that the film was under, and then figuring out the financial side? I mean, how did you process all that?
I mean, I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do the whole thing. I knew that by the second or third year, I'd at least have a seat at the table. So, that nobody could finish it without my involvement, so that it would be some type of return on my, at that point, it was mostly an investment of time. At that point, I didn't really approach it with a lot of capital, not at that stage. And then that part came a little bit later, where I figured like, okay, I had a controlling interest, and that anybody else coming in would ultimately have to do it the way that I wanted to do it. And where in terms of financing it, it was tricky because at that point I reached out to Frank, and Frank and I teamed up. At that point I had all the French rights, or the rights to the negative. And so I felt like, we had enough together, and then Frank and I jointly made the next few approaches. And then I believe I was in Toronto, and we really, Frank and I met with all the studios. There was interest, but when they figured out what the cost of it was, obviously it was very top heavy with rights. And when they figured out what the cost was, distributors started to lose interest, and they would lowball us. And I had something put together, which was, through sales and a domestic distributor, and it was still very piecemealed, but we had something to move forward with. And that's when I think I was in Toronto, and I had met with Netflix twice. And it was in Toronto that, basically I met with them, and I said, I have this whole piecemeal distribution, this structure. And if you guys are really serious about this, I'm going to need something within the next 48 hours. And at that point, it was the three films. That was the idea of it. It was going to be Other Side of the Wind, I Love You When I'm Dead, before it had a title, and then Final Cut for Orson. And so Netflix said, yeah, we want all three. And it was exactly what I asked for, is what they, was the ultimate budget for for all three.
Other Side of the Wind, Let Me When I'm Dead, and the Hopper Wells?
No, and Final Cut for Orson, which was the behind the scenes piece that Ryan Suffern directed.
Oh, I don't know.
Frank, so Frank's production company really took the lead on it, because he has a documentary division at Kennedy Marshall. And so we had Ryan Suffern direct that piece, and that was just the behind the scenes of us finishing Other Side of the Wind.
Oh,
and that was part of a 3-picture delivery to Netflix.
Oh, I'm unfamiliar with that last part. I'm deeply ashamed to say.
It turned out really well. It's a wonderful little piece.
Is that on Netflix?
It's on Netflix, but it's under Trailers and More of Other Side of the Wind.
Gotcha.
So it's not its own separate title. Okay. I think what Netflix wanted to do is almost treat it like you would on a Blu-ray, like a supplemental piece.
Sure.
Which wouldn't necessarily compete for space with Morgan's documentary, so there wouldn't be confusion that there are suddenly two documentaries. So this was this was a featurette, is what we called it internally.
I see, right. It was for marketing and delineation and all that. I understand. Makes a lot of sense. But good, another treat I missed that one completely. But and then so where does the Hopper Welles documentary, and this is Orson shooting Welles, they're sitting together and having a very long conversation. And this feels like as close to just sort of I mean, if it's edited, which I know it's very edited, but I mean, it doesn't feel like it's edited for anything but just in fact to improve continuity almost, and to make improvements, not to take away. So it's a very fluid conversation that really holds together. So it's a kind of essential for anybody who is interested in these guys and at this time period. So why don't you take me through a little bit of that, when you found out that this thing existed, or did you know? And
well, we knew it existed. We also knew that it didn't fit into Other Side of the Wind. It didn't fit. It were 5 hours of material, or 4 hours and 48 minutes between the two cameras. So you're talking about a slightly under 2.5 hour yield between the two cameras. And it just, once we started editing it, we just felt like this was its own thing. And Bob put it together, put whatever 13 rolls, however many rolls there are, just put it together, kind of from slate to run out. And he watched it, and I think he watched it first in whole, and he came away really fascinated by it. I watched it as well. At that point, if something didn't fit into the other side of the wind, then the first thing I did was pick up the phone and call Morgan and say, hey, I have something which is a curio. This might be of interest to you for The Love Me When I'm Dead, because really both editorial teams were working in parallel, but they were siloed. Morgan didn't want his editorial team to see Other Side of the Wind. And obviously, with Bob Murawski, I mean, he wasn't going over to their side to see what they were doing on the dock, because he was just focused on the feature. And Morgan took a look at it. It didn't fit the narrative, what he was shaping with The Love Me When I'm Dead. So this just felt like its own separate thing. And I watched it, and I just thought, okay, this is fascinating. It's a wonderful conversation. And I set it aside. Mm-hmm. And I didn't get back to it until a year and a half later. I mean, I came out of that whole process with a whole lot of Welles fatigue, because at that point it was 9 years. Wow. I was prepping one production, and then I was actually in a production and prepping another one. So I had 2 narrative features that were coming right on the heels of finishing Other Side of the Wind. So it took me about a year and a half to get back to it. And a friend of mine, Nick Ebeling, who directed Along for the Ride.
Nick's a friend too. More.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah. His film, his recent film.
So I was at lunch with Nick in LA, and he asked me, how much do you have? What's it like? And so I started talking or describing the material to Nick very enthusiastically. Just everything that I remembered, what the conversation was about, how much Hopper revealed about last movie, and just the things that stuck with me, which was more the beginning half of the film, more about their conversation, about filmmakers they admired, and about the craft of filmmaking. And so so at Nick's urging, he said, well, take a look at it, maybe send me something. And so that was really the first kind of little seed where I went back. I asked Netflix, because we had all that stuff backed up. And I went back and I watched the whole thing. And suddenly I was struck by the second part of the film, because suddenly, it's the film was the same, but we had changed, and the times we were living in had changed. So suddenly the stuff that I remembered, the stuff about filmmaking, it was still there, but suddenly all the political stuff they were talking about just felt so timely and so powerful. And I just figured, okay, I think there's something here. And enough time had gone by where I had a new perspective on the Welles universe, and I felt like, let me see if this could be a standalone piece, if there's something in it. And then Nick and I had a conversation with one of the programmers in Venice, who's also a mutual friend of ours. And she asked to see, and she basically said, I heard from Nick that you have this Hopper stuff, could I see something? And I got on the phone with her, and she said, you absolutely have to finish this. It's an important historical document. We'd love to have it for the festival. Can you get it finished in time? And so the next step was calling up Bob Murawski and saying, are you ready to take on another Welles project? And he remembered the material much better than I did. So he said, absolutely, as if he was just waiting for that phone call this whole time. So he said, let's get into it.
Yeah, well, Welles has another also directorial credit in his IMDb, each as a result. Another finished film, which is always a nice plus for that. What kept, as I was watching it, and I can't wait to rewatch it actually the second time, but what struck me was, and I've read his conversations with Peter Bogdanovich, those are published. There's conversations with Henry Jaglom, those are published, and he's such a he's so difficult, Welles, and he's so full of himself and narcissistic. He comes across that way. I mean, we know that he's full of bluster and bravado, but in this instance, it's not that it's absent, but he seems to have a very different tone with Dennis Hopper. I know it's just 2 hours plus, but um, you know, he seems to have an enormous amount of respect for Dennis Hopper as an artist. He just doesn't give him the hard time that I've read him give the other guys.
I mean, I still think he gives him a really hard time.
It's a
You know,
relative.
it's to me, it's this is one of those pieces where you're never quite sure if Orson's speaking as Orson and when he's speaking as Jake,
Oh, that's
as
right.
the character. As,
Explain that. Yeah.
yeah. So, because at some points, you know, he switches into the Jake Hannaford character, which ultimately is played by John Huston. I do think he tries to provoke and uses the voice of Jake Hannaford to try to get a response from Hopper, who's so hard to pin down. He's so elusive. He's you know, he really feels uncomfortable in the role that he was cast in as somebody who was a leader of what was then a revolutionary movement. And you know, and I think Wells does label him as I'm trying to remember, is it the unwilling revolutionary or no, reluctant revolutionary?
Reluctant, yeah.
And so I think with a lot of this stuff, you know, on a kind of a point by point basis, I think it's sometimes tough to separate, you know, where it's Wells and where it's Jake. I do though think that, and I think a lot of people who, you know, kind of who watch the film that I've discussed it with have come away with a take that this is, you know, less so conversation than it is interrogation, which, you know, I see that point, especially the second part, really taking Hopper to task on his political views and on his lack of activism.
But it's yeah, I guess so. However, I look at it in a way that's not. He doesn't seem to. I mean, again, maybe I need to watch the whole thing again. But it seemed like he wasn't doing it in quite such a patronizing tone. But again, I may have missed that. I just feel like, and you know, I wasn't watching film content of his conversations with Peter Bogdanovich. I've just read it. So I don't know what the tone in his voice was, but it reads a lot more difficult of, you know, of a personality.
Yeah, I mean, it's Wells invited him, so this much I know is that, you know, Hopper flew to LA at Wells's request.
Right.
So I think this was already a massive honor, and Hopper absolutely revered Wells. I mean, it's, you know, he did Easy Rider on the, you know, based on the Wells model, where he directed, produced, wrote, starred in, and
right.
And so, and this was something where, you know, so he absolutely revered him. And for Wells, he was interested in this young hotshot, somebody who was then the toast of Hollywood, and he wanted to, you know, see if he was maybe worth the acclaim. I think he's testing him on both film knowledge. It's interesting that he doesn't correct him when he makes mistakes. I'm not sure if, you know, if Wells was catching those mistakes, how current he was in terms of, you know, current cinema, especially European cinema, because that's really what they were discussing more so than anything American. But you know, it's to me, you know, there's certainly funny moments with Antonioni. Also, very strange that Orson Welles wouldn't know who Bob Dylan is at that point, and you know, in November of 1970. I mean, talk about, you know, somebody who was a counterculture icon. And so, you know, and I thought Wells was, you know, pretty hip when it came to pop culture. So, or counterculture.
It's a surprise that you did do a Dick Cavett show with Bob Dylan or something. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Also, you know, one thing is that he did have a very complicated relationship, Wells, with Peter. Their power their sort of I guess you call it a sort of, not a power structure, but, you know, they definitely had it was difficult for Wells, especially, of course, as Peter Rose. We know that, but you know, well, the other thing is, when you were talking about Dylan, maybe he was Hannaford in that moment. Maybe.
Well, I mean, it's
Hannaford didn't know.
We don't know, right? It's fun to speculate. I think it's fun to speculate for a lot of the stuff that he drops in there. There's a lot of things, and, you know, and obviously when it comes to, you know, some of the, some of the political stuff. You know, when he's talking about Franco's side of the war, when he's talking, no, now I'm speaking as Hannaford. So some of that stuff he's just trying to provoke a response. But I mean, I have no idea. Yeah, I think, you know, we'll never know. It's just left to speculate at which point is it Orson, at which point is it Jig.
What is your sense through these projects about Wells is coming from the traditional Hollywood, although he was never traditional in that, you know, context, or in that context, he really wasn't ever traditional, but he does come from a very different generation, and all of a sudden he's working with these young folks, you know, and seems very curious and wants to, you know, wants to collaborate with these guys like Peter, like Dennis Hopper, and Peter Bogdanovich, not Peter Fonda, but so what's your sense in terms of Wells, you know, his journey like through that? Do you feel like he embraced the generation?
I mean, hard for me to say. I think there was a curiosity. I mean, clearly he was surrounding himself, and if you look at the script, there were certainly many more filmmakers who he hoped would show up to that party, which they eventually shot in '72 and '73. That takes place in the whole second and third act of Other Side of the Wind. I think he was curious. I think he was especially curious by those filmmakers who kind of set out to make independent films, who wanted to. Who respected the autonomy that Orson wanted to maintain in his filmmaking. And many of them regarded him as the first independent filmmaker. And I think, you know, kind of New Hollywood certainly had a lot of those principles.
I actually wanted to talk a little bit, I don't know how much more time you have. We can wind it down soon, but I wanted to talk about Gary Rayburn, who shot this, and he also had an interesting relationship with Wells. He was maybe the greatest devotee of Wells. I mean, how much do you know about Gary?
I mean, I know quite a bit through Bob. So Bob Murawski, the editor of both the pieces, right, of Other Side of the Wind and Hopper Wells. So he lived, I think, 3 houses down from Gary. So and we didn't know that prior to the meeting with Bob. So Frank Marshall and I met with him, and you know, he was approaching us through various parties. I mean, Bob really wanted the gig, and we didn't know how close he was to the material through Gary. So I ended up learning quite a bit about him through Bob, and then I developed a relationship with his son Sean, who helped us, you know, gave us a lot of materials that Gary had left behind from his editing process, etc. So, but in terms of, you know, what struck me about Hopper Wells and this material is the aesthetic, and I loved this, you know, this kind of almost Pennebaker-like camera that's just constantly going around, and it makes, to me, this 2-hour conversation as lively or livelier because of the camera work. And to me, this felt like a camera test. This is way different than the other interviews, than the interviews with Mazursky and Jaglom and with Curtis Harrington. To me, this is just way more. And when we were talking about,
oh, you just cut out for a second. I'm sure I got the recording, but I didn't hear what you just, the last part.
I'm saying that the aesthetic of it, it just, to me, felt like this was such a cool camera test for Other Side of the Wind. Because if we're talking about November of 1970, eventually a lot of the party scenes for the feature would take on this type of style. This handheld, you know, kind of zooming in so fast so you are able to get focused, and then zooming back out. And so this felt like an extended camera test. And I love the rawness of it. And I felt like, especially with, you know, the way that we ended up editing it and keeping the slates in and making it feel like you're there in the room, you can't escape the same way that Hopper can't escape. And and I love that. I loved the form. And obviously, that's why we put that little piece at the beginning with, and I believe that's Gary's wife, Connie Graver, then wife, who was the camera assistant. So she coming in with a slate in front of Hopper's face, and Orson says, get that slate in there and don't ask so nicely. And so it sets it up because Hopper's constantly has that slate put in front of his face, can't break concentration because Wells never lets up. And to me, keeping those in, made it so that conversation feels way more intimate, because you're given the whole thing. And so, I really like that, including that grandfather clock striking 3 times. You even have that passage of time element in it. So it just feels like this very intimate, fireside conversation between Hopper and Wells.
It's called it's called Hopper Wells, and it premiered at Toronto?
Venice.
Venice, that makes sense because they asked for it, right? You mentioned
yeah.
Did it, and then
that would have been one way to do it, right? It's they asked for it and then to give it to another festival.
Well, it would have been more like Wells' way of sort of working, but it did. And then it played at Toronto?
No.
It did not. Okay, let me rephrase. I'll just get that part out. So it premiered at Vienna, and now it's at the New York Film Festival. Venice. What did I say? Vienna. Sorry, it's early here. It's 11. My God, I never. So premiered. I'll actually leave it in. Okay, so Hopper Wells. It premiered at Venice, and then it's going to be at the New York Film Festival.
Yeah, we had a driving screening, which was wonderful on the 18th. Which I'm in Europe right now, so I unfortunately missed.
Oh, are you?
There was a screening at Queens, and then I believe it goes on the virtual cinema starting today.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Everybody's got to see this. Anybody who's remotely interested in this subject matter we've been discussing, but Dennis Hopper rising to the top of his career. Well, what a career he had, but pre-apocalypse, post Easy Rider.
Pre-apocalypse, but already having his little thing about fractions in his head. So already working that material.
I hope this is just 2 now. I hope there are more projects ahead, Philip. I look forward to seeing more.
Thank you very much.
It's really nice meeting you. And where are you? And you mentioned you're in Europe.
I'm currently in Warsaw. This is a pit stop from Italy, and then a bunch of more festivals on this side of the world where they're actually still doing in-person festivals.
And where do you call home?
You know what, LA, but let me tell you, it's been I came to Warsaw for 4 days in March, and here I am.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so it's a confinement kept me on this side, so I've been between Poland and France.
Okay, I could think of worse things, kind of doing the Polanski.
Except not in hiding, but yes.
Oh, yeah. Stay put. That's all I could say, at least for a few more months. That's my advice. It's really nice to make your acquaintance, and I hope we can pick this up again sometime. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Adam. Take care.
Or you too. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye-bye.